4, 3, 2, 1. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this panel where we will be talking about climate-friendly permanent crops. I'm very glad to join today this session, and we have today with us Thekla Teunis, who is founder and director of Grounded, based in South Africa. We also have Paul McMahon, managing partner of SLM Partners, based in the US. And John Leary, Executive Director of Tree for the Future in the US.
Thank you.
Today we have a very interesting and exciting panel with people from different backgrounds and in different geographies. So I'd like, first of all, to allow you to introduce yourself and tell us more about what you are doing at the moment in this space. So maybe we can start with you, Thekla.
Thanks a lot, Roberto. So I'm Thekla, and I am the co-founder of Grounded. We operate in Southern Africa. What we do is we work with farmers to help them transition into regenerative agriculture. And we do that by actually, providing them the support on how to do that on the land, but also we build operating companies that process and then market the products that they farm. And then we try to access premium prices so that they can be rewarded for their efforts to switch to regenerative. So the crops that we focus on is mostly non-perishable, high-value ingredients. It's herbal tea, herbs and spices, essential and vegetable oils. And we're currently active in South Africa, Zambia, and we're starting in Tanzania. And apart from these operating companies, we're launching an online platform in May to provide these regeneratively produced crops to the market in a more easy way than what is happening right now.
Thank you, Thekla. Thank you so much. Maybe we can stay in Africa and have you, John, tell us more about what you have been doing.
Appreciate it. John Leary from Trees for the Future. We have an agroforestry model. We're working in East and West Africa to apply that is helping chronically food insecure communities rise out of hunger and poverty. And what we do with the trees is we do agroforestry, living fences, windbreaks around fields to protect them. And then inside the protection, we do alley cropping and other agroforestry to bring all kinds of new products and nutritious gains. And there's a lot of other regenerative techniques we train farmers in to make the whole forest garden quite regenerative, optimize. Every acre, every hectare has thousands of trees, dozens of types of food crops. That's a forest garden. So our work right now is adapting that to different cropping systems and contexts all across Africa and all around the world. So I'm happy to be here. Thank you, Roberto.
Thank you, John. And Paul, would be great to hear from you as well.
Yeah, thanks, Roberto. Paul McMahon, one of the co-founders, managing partner of SLM Partners. We've been going since 2009. We're an investment management firm. We raise capital and we use that capital to scale up more regenerative and ecological farming and forestry systems. We've got about $210 million of assets under management now. 3 different strategies around the world. We invest in grass-fed beef in Australia, organic grains in the US, and also forestry in Ireland. But we are developing a new strategy in Europe, which is focused on, let's say, tree crops more broadly defined. We're looking to integrate forestry with permanent crops. And we've been spending a lot of time digging into permanent crops, in particular in Spain and Portugal. And those are the Mediterranean crops such as olives, almonds, pistachios, walnuts, pine nuts, even interesting products such as cork oak. And we think there's a real potential both from market side, but also environmental side to invest in more regenerative and, let's say, organic versions of these permanent crop systems.
Great. Excellent. Thank you so much, Paul, for that introduction. And maybe we can start with you to touch on this area of what regenerative agriculture means today, what agroforestry projects mean today, both for investors, for local communities, for asset managers. And Paul, you have been navigating the whole agriculture space in the last decade or so. And now you are focusing on this area that you were just describing. Could you please tell us more from an investor point of view, and also from the practices you're applying? Why it makes sense? What is the rationale behind that? I'm sure that this will help us to set the stage for this topic.
Sure. Yeah, I think, and there's maybe two parts to the answer. There's a market dimension, let's say environmental dimension. I think the market dimension is that permanent crops produce healthy, nutritious foods which are highly in demand amongst consumers, and high value crops. And whether that's almonds or olives, more temperate or Mediterranean crops, or whether more tropical crops, we'll hear probably more about from John and Thekla. But these are high value products, widely traded. Some of the highest value, let's say, per kilo of any food that you'll get. And as you see younger consumer trends getting around things like almond milk and healthy, nutritious foods, alternatives to meat, we see those markets growing and growing. So I think, and if you look at permanent crops compared to, say, annual crops or livestock or dairy, or how it fits into broader agriculture investment portfolios, they have performed well. They tend to produce, let's say, higher returns than, say, annual crops. There can be volatility. The trees are in the ground for 20, 30 years plus, so there is some risk as well, but typically they do produce good return. I think on the environmental side, there's been a lot of work in probably more annual agriculture around regenerative agriculture, sort of emerging body of science and standards around what regenerative means, and it typically means reducing tillage and using cover crops and moving diverse crop rotations, integrating livestock. We haven't seen such a definition of what it means in the context of permanent crops yet. But we actually think there's some really interesting opportunities here. I think the first, probably most clearly, is permanent crops are trees, and trees store carbon. And so actually taking whether grazing land or arable land and planting permanent crops, planting trees or agroforestry systems, we have the potential to store a lot more carbon above ground and as well as below ground. So we think they'd be really positive for carbon. And one goal we have for our new strategy in Europe is developing a net zero or even positive portfolio, so we can show we're storing more carbon than we emit. I think that is truly possible with permanent crops. I think the second point is probably more around practices, within the orchards. And we're seeing some really interesting innovations coming through, typically, again, using cover crops to build soil health, trying to minimize use of pesticides, using integrated pest management, using biological amendments and composts, and really trying to build up the health of the soil and trying to get more, let's say, fertility and pest control natural systems. And then probably the further step is going fully organic and organic certified. We think there's a real opportunity there because we think that can really good impacts in the environment, but then you're getting very strong price premiums as well from the consumer side.
Thank you, Paul. And I guess it's interesting to hear how these practices or the different approaches that we have in different regions. So maybe, Thekla, you can also tell us more about how you implement your own, farming methods in the operations you have, and also maybe tell us not just the good thing, but also the challenges, that you face when you're going into these kind of systems.
Thanks. I can give an example of one a company that we're working on is doing essential oils. So we planted lavender and rosemary, and on paper these are excellent crops. They're also permanent crops. They're not trees, but they last for about 10 years or longer. And they're really great on paper because they can actually act as a sort of natural pesticide. They are quite sturdy and hard. So what we did is we planted those and did cover cropping in between the rows. And first I'll maybe give you the end picture of what it can look like, which is actually now it's really nice. We've got rosemary growing really nicely, and then farmers apply compost and actually a lot of compost tea as well, which is slightly more efficient to apply because you can put it through the drip irrigation. And then they can actually graze because they've got small livestock. So you can let goats and sheep actually graze in between the rows and kind of eat the cover crop because they won't touch the essential oil crop. They don't like it. They don't eat rosemary. So this gives the farmer a double income of the land because you can use it for grazing and to harvest the crop. which in this case for rosemary, it's a very interesting crop because you can actually make oil out of it, but you can also dry it and then sell it as just as a herb for the food industry, but you can also sell it into the food ingredient industry because there is a molecule in rosemary that is used as a food preservative. It's called carnosic acid. So this crop is actually excellent in these conditions, but we've had many challenges in establishing this operation. First, we actually started off with lavender because it also had big potential on paper, but it turned out that lavender didn't really grow in the area, so we had to write off almost all of those lands. On the rosemary, people told us that it's a natural pesticide, so you won't get any pests. But then we had an outbreak of cutworm, which also the experts told us, no, there's no way that cutworm is going to eat rosemary, but it did. So we lost 70% on one farm. So that farmer had to just start from scratch again. Another challenge was, it's all nice to say you need to establish cover crops, but the question always is, in a particular area, which crops do you then actually plant? Like what kind of mix is actually right for the soil on a specific farm? So you need quite a bit of technical expertise. And then a challenge that we had is that when we started planting, it was the start of what turned out to be a 5-year drought in South Africa in that particular area, which is actually still happening today. But it's very hard to plant cover crops during a drought because then you don't have enough water to irrigate. So in our case, we had drip irrigation like along the plants, but then the rest of the field is just bare. So there are quite a lot of, more practical challenges like these, let alone like getting the crops to the market, because what we also found is that the market for regenerative is still very small. So for instance, we were fully organically certified, but for the dried rosemary, the market for organic certified is just very small. So, we produce container loads, but we can only sell a very small portion as organically certified, and the rest will just go into bulk markets. So to translate all these efforts and the pain of these transitions into value is also tricky. Yeah, I'll stop here. I can just go and continue for an hour.
No, but it's very exciting when you get into the specific crops and these ones in particular. I'm sure that it must be fascinating how to work on the technical side, but also on the commercial side, and we will touch on that later on. But we heard from Paul, looking in Europe today, and also from Thekla in South Africa. John, please tell us what agroforestry means for you when you are working in East Africa, West Africa, how you look at that.
Agroforestry is the integration of trees into farms and croplands, and there's so many different ways to do it. You can disperse the trees, you can put them in rows, you can achieve all kinds of different things. And so usually it's talking with the farmer and trying to figure out what he or she or what the family's trying to achieve. Most families that we work with are always concerned about just overall production, food, nutritional needs. They're always concerned about the soil, the quality of the soil. Every farmer I've ever spoken with is talking about how their soil is dying over time. They usually have livestock as well that they want to feed. They're concerned about milk. They want to keep the animals healthy. And so we're able to take all of the different factors, all the kind of needs of the family and also the market opportunities and address them all with agroforestry. So agroforestry is a little bit of a longer term thinking too. I think the annual crops that we see are causing so much destruction across all the landscapes around the world is short-term thinking. Agroforestry gets us thinking 3, 5, 10 years out. And like Paul said, usually you're also dealing with a higher value, set of crops. And I think that's very important as we try to get farmers to transition away from, crops that they've been, stuck in extreme poverty for many years. Well, through agroforestry, there's opportunity. And the living fences I mentioned earlier, those keep the goats out, those keep the cows out, they keep people out, they keep all the risks out. The windbreaks dampen the winds and the storms, and you know, and so now within the protection using agroforestry, now farmers can invest. They don't have to do the traditional crops of either maize or peanuts and things like that, but they can start to get into bushes and fruit trees and lots of other market-based crops that can bring a lot more income.
And John, when we think about specifically those crops that you are working on, which crops are we talking about?
So in Senegal, where I've been working for 20 years now, the peanut basin is being desertified. It's becoming the desert quickly because of peanut production. And peanuts are incredibly destructive. You have to rip, you know, you have to plow up the whole peanut plant in order to harvest it. And so when you do that to a landscape, the impact is quite terrible. Training farmers to shift from a peanut-based monocrop into an agroforestry. So we'll start out with a tree like the jujube. It's thorny. It's got a berry on it. You can sell the berry. There's the improved variety now that's bigger. It's the desert apple. It's awesome. It tastes, it's juicy. It's grown in arid zones. Well, we plant that all around it. So you've got one crop to sell. But inside of the protection there, we see farmers shifting from something like peanuts, which was destructive, now to cashew trees. So if anybody out there is trying to, you know, pick whether you want to buy peanut butter or cashew butter, our choices matter. And in the cashew trees, it's a tree, it's permanent. And beneath the cashew trees, we've got a lot of a couple other things. So I mentioned the jujubes. Those are a good fruit. And the Cajun is Cajun pigeon peas, which is 3, 4, 5, 6 years out of the pigeon peas as well. So we're shifting from a monocrop that's somewhat destructive into a layered tree cropping system, producing cashews, pigeon peas, the jujubes as well. And underneath those, other perennials, as well as permagardens and hot peppers and lettuce and things like that. So the diversity that ends up coming out of agroforestry systems is quite important too, if we wanted to talk about beneficial insects and IPM and the pests that Thekla had mentioned a little earlier. Yeah.
Right. Thank you, John. I think while I was listening to you, I was thinking that, you know, I'm based in Luxembourg, and when I go to the supermarket nowadays, I can buy kiwis from New Zealand, table grapes from Namibia, or actually citrus from South Africa. And of course, you know, almonds and citrus and berries and avocados from Spain, Portugal, as well as almost anything coming from Chile, Peru, and Mexico. And if you think as you know, if you put in the place of an investor, most investors realize that in contrast to some of the mainstream crops, you know, soybean, corn, where they are essentially commodities that can be marketed very easily, and where there is a very, let's say, large and liquid market. When it comes to many of the crops that you are producing, that integration to get closer to the distribution, to the retail, that capability to add value to that production from the farm becomes very relevant to drive also those returns that you're having in mind. So maybe it would be interesting to hear a little more about how each of you are approaching this. Maybe Paul, you want to talk about, you know, the crops that you are planning to produce, and then how you look at the commercial side. You're in mute, sorry.
So yeah, I'd say our focus in Europe tends to be on, let's say, the less perishable, you know, nuts in particular, and olives. I think, you know, there are more perishable permanent crops, whether they're berries, you know, avocados, others, where, let's say, the supply chain becomes even more important. And one of the advantages of dealing with things like almonds, pistachios, walnuts, you know, they do last, they do store well. Having said that, often they do need to be processed quickly. You need to be dehulled or deshelled, and the initial stage of processing is important. For example, in pistachios, you need to do it within the first 24 hours after harvest, so else you have a real deterioration quality. So it is important that you have good access to processing facilities. We've thought a lot about this, and, you know, we've seen other people invest in full vertical integration, where they're looking to own the land, own the trees, you know, operate that land, and also own processing and even brands, selling all the way to retailers. Our focus is a little bit different. You know, we're building, we tend to invest on land. We focus on land as a real asset and trees. You know, we want to have a relatively low cost of capital because we work with institutional investors who are looking for, you know, long-term stable returns from real assets, inflation proofed, you know, with a steady income. Doesn't have to be double-digit returns, private equity type returns. So that's where land and trees is perfect for them. We would then look to partner with local operating teams and companies who have the people and machinery on the ground to do day-to-day operations of the orchards, but also have those processing facilities. And we're finding a lot of companies in Spain and Portugal who might have some production, who've invested heavily in processing. They really want more volume. They want to put more volume through the processing facilities. But when they look at the price of land and the capex required to develop new orchards, they don't necessarily want that in their balance sheet. And so we think there's a really natural partnership between the long-term land investors with a lower cost of capital and these operating companies who have, let's say, a higher private equity type cost of capital to come together. And then I think it's a question of how do you structure that partnership? And we've been relatively creative about that. It's not just a lease structure. Actually, there's ways to structure where you're sharing operating expenses, but also sharing production and sharing risk. And we've found that has been very well received by some of these operating companies in Spain and Portugal in particular. So that's how we solve it. We don't try and own it all. We have to partner with great teams who have the supply chains in place.
Thank you, Paul. That's very, very insightful. I know, Thekla, that you actually started touching the point about the commercial aspect of your operation there. I wonder if you actually get into any kind of processing as part of the business, and how do you typically work on the commercial side? For example, is that mostly a local market? It's mostly an export market? How do you see it?
Yeah. So it actually quite nicely builds on what Paul was saying, because we do almost the opposite. We actually we position ourselves in the middle. So we don't own any land. The land stays with the farmer, and the farmer operation is separate. But then we, with the operating companies that we establish, we purchase the produce from the farmers, process it. We do product development in-house to ensure that we have premium quality, and then we do marketing. And for that, our approach is to create various different product market combinations, because that makes our operations more resilient. So actually, in quite a few cases, the local markets are very attractive in Africa, and also can, in some cases, just generate higher returns for the farmers and for us. So we, in Zambia, for instance, we also have a kind of agroforestry system where we do vegetables and spices, but then the vegetables all just go into local markets. So one is local markets. Then the second is wholesale for large volumes. So those are like one-on-one B2B deals with large players, where we sell the bulk of the produce that will go into export markets. This is, for instance, the case in herbal tea company that we have established in South Africa. And then the third one is one that we're establishing now, and which we're actually quite excited about from a potential point of view, is an online platform for regeneratively produced ingredients that goes directly to small niche brands who also have a claim towards consumers that they are offering something which is sustainably and ethically produced, and who are looking for smaller volumes that they cannot get through the traditional wholesale platforms. And then we provide like full transparency and products that come straight from the source, basically. So those are our three kind of channels. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank
but
you.
We don't do any brands. So we sit just right in the middle. We don't have our own brand. We only sell to brands. Yeah.
And I think that, John, you also have your own approach. I think that when you work with small farmers, the access to the market makes the whole difference sometimes to finally achieve the impact that you're looking for. So how do you approach that?
Yeah, it's a little, when we deal with agroforestry, diversity is important. It's not an intensification strategy where you're going to put all your eggs in one basket, or you're going to go, I'm going to do one crop and I'm going to do it well, and I'm going to get one big payday. This is a diversification strategy. So even though you might think it makes the marketing a little bit more difficult because you've got more things that you got to look at the marketing for, it spreads the risk for smallholder farmers. It's infinitely better in the long term for smallholder farmers to not be investing all of their eggs in one basket year after year after year after year after year. So by diversifying, I mentioned earlier, cashews, pigeon peas, jujube, now we've got different products. And all of those products, when we think vertical integration, we're thinking through the farmer's eyes. How can the farmer add value, process? How can the farmer and the nascent farmer group as a nascent business, capture more of that value? What we've seen is twofold. And I'll mention quickly on the financial end, it's been very advantageous for our smallholder farmer groups to not just learn and go through our training program to grow forest gardens on degraded land, but also to learn how to start savings clubs and to get into, and we're training the leadership in agro enterprise. And so by doing this and by getting the savings clubs, every farmer group, 25 women coming together, 25 community members coming together, they have a pot of money that they're managing. And through that, we're getting micro loans out to the members. When people need bags, they need to dry something, they need to get a vehicle, they need to get stuff to market. They're able to self-finance a lot of the initial steps. So what we're happy to see is after 4 or 5 years of working with a group, the group that started with everybody at degraded plots of land doing peanuts, now the group is getting cashews to the market. They're getting the pigeon peas. The cashews are usually international. They're going to the capital city. They're getting bulked somewhere and going out. A lot of the fruits and vegetables are being sold in local towns and local markets. And then you might have a jatropha, or you have something, the jujube, that for which there's traders coming through. So from our perspective for the farmers, we would like to see them accessing multiple different markets and not reliant upon one. So part of that is the diversification. If it's mangoes, if we need mangoes, even at that, we're usually looking at how can we have early season, mid-season, and late season mangoes, just to always keep kind of diversifying the offerings that farmers have. And then at the end of the day, it's an aggregation challenge. It's working with farmer groups. We go from 25 people, the 25s are in hundreds, the hundreds are grouped into thousands, and the producer groups are coming together. Savings clubs kind of bind them, but it's the markets, as you mentioned, are the essential long-term key thing. So in the group, in a landscape, there might be 2 or 3 or 4 products that we really help in the market development of, but the others is local vegetable sales, going to the market. It's people transporting their own crops to market and working in smaller groups as well. So,
thank you, John. And I guess we have so many topics to touch, and I just wanted to make a high-level observation here to put some perspective. And I cannot avoid mentioning, what COVID has brought to our space. And in some ways, we are all aware that the broad food and ag sector has been very resilient. And we have got, I would say, from an investment point of view, my impression is that many investors have wake up to the opportunity. In some cases, Paul, you were talking about, the exposure to real assets. We also talk about, the opportunity to invest in areas that can improve nutrition in different ways. And we have seen, for example, if we look at what Europe is doing, we see the European farm to fork strategy and all the push to decarbonize the sector and trying to, mitigate the effects of climate change. So a lot of different components are today, I wouldn't say creating the perfect storm, but definitely we see this interest, which is also reflected in interest for innovation and technologies around, farming that probably all of you are bringing or adopting in different ways. I think that also investors are looking at some of the topics like, not just the land and the production, but also the access to water. And also, of course, all this growing discussion about the carbon markets, carbon credits, and how these investment opportunities or these operating companies can also help in that sense. So maybe it would be interesting, I'm not sure who of you wants to start, but it would be very interesting to listen from you about how you look at some of these topics, either if it's, the carbon markets, water, technology adoption. Paul, maybe you want to touch on that?
Yeah, and maybe just talk a little bit in the European context. I think the European Union is really trying to be a leader in this, in a sort of macro, almost geopolitical context, and has set some very, very ambitious targets. And there's a whole raft of, let's say, policy initiatives coming out of Brussels, all kind of nested within one another, you could say. I mean, there's the climate strategy where the EU wants to be sort of carbon neutral by 2050. So that's going to drive change to every single economic sector, including agriculture. And so we would hope it'll help deliver on that, by investing in these, let's say, carbon neutral, even carbon positive orchard systems and land management systems. We're restoring more carbon than we emit. The second, around the EU farm to fork strategy, which is all around a shift towards more sustainable farming and, let's say, and more healthy, nutritious food. There's specific targets there around shifting 25% of all European agriculture land to organic certification by 2030. Now that the EU is less than 10% now, so that's going to involve some significant change. Again, with our new fund in Europe, we'd be looking to help with that because we want to take conventional orchards in Spain and Portugal, convert to organic certification. Maybe a third is around biodiversity. We think that topic's actually getting increasing attention as well from investors. And there's some, let's say, quite justifiable concerns about heavy use of pesticides and the impacts that can have on biodiversity in these some very intensive orchard systems. And again, I think a shift to more biological, regenerative practices, organic practices is going to help boost biodiversity. And probably finally, water, absolutely. And when you're looking at irrigated orchards, which we are to a large extent in the Mediterranean Europe, that's of course a huge issue. So I think, that's where we do a lot of work looking at long-term climate predictions, looking at water availability, looking for very reliable sources of surface water, make sure we're not certainly sucking dry, aquifers, groundwater, in an unsustainable way. So yeah, I think what we're trying to do is align all our investments in Europe with these top-down, almost policy level targets, and show we can help deliver that. We think that's very attractive to investors too, because they're kind of making top-down commitments as well on their side about how they're going to align all their investments with these macro policies.
Yeah, and that really, I have a lot of ideas from what you said that could be interesting to keep discussing. Maybe Thekla, you want to also tell us how, at the end of the day, you incorporate some of these, topics and trends and factors into your operations, and also maybe if you deal with, with your stakeholders, how they also look at these components,
Yeah, it's an interesting question. The carbon market, it's a difficult one, I think. We have looked at it from the beginning. When I started 8 years ago, then it was a very risky business, not something that I would say to a farmer, okay, you can just stop farming and start farming carbon and you will be fine, So it's always something that we look at on the side. Now it seems to be picking up a lot. I think the risk that I would see more structural is if people start focusing on carbon as a single issue, then we start optimizing only for carbon, but actually the point of regenerative agriculture is, I think, much broader. So that's maybe a little bit something I would be scared about, optimizing on a single component. I do think it has great potential, so we are looking into it. Like, can we, use it as a supplementary income for farmers? Water is very relevant especially in the areas in South Africa where we operate. We have actually done and are still doing, like our NGO that we partner with is working on a project with the Coca-Cola Africa Foundation. They have an ambition to be water neutral as a company, and they have a bottling plant downstream from the ecosystem where we work. And so they can do like offsetting for the water that they use in the bottles of Coca-Cola. We calculated how many trees we need to plant on the degraded hillsides or like do broader restoration efforts there. So that's actually funded by Coca-Cola. I think that's a great example of how, because water is a local issue, so you'll always need to work with a local stakeholder. it would be fantastic, I think, if more companies would follow that kind of example. It's really, really great. I think on organic certification, Paul touched upon that. It's in the EU that they're pushing it. What I was thinking, it's almost maybe a little bit cynical, or I don't know what the word is in English, that in Africa, many farmers are actually organic by default, but it's too costly to get the organic certification done. So many of them are not organically certified, but they do produce organically. So I think almost maybe a challenge to the sort of technology companies or maybe investors out there would be to see, can you create a clever way to get this organic certification done in a, just a little bit more cost efficiently. I know there are ways out there, but this is a massive hurdle for farmers we work with.
Yeah, thank you, Thekla. And we see, as probably as consumers also, we see more and more labels coming to the market and to the products, and it's going to be interesting how that kind of evolves in time. And John, I'm sure that you also have different conversations around these topics with your stakeholders. They have expectations. Your farmer, these farmer networks that work with you also have challenges around what we were talking about, you know, the impact of climate change and water accessibility, so you know, and probably the topic of carbon markets, carbon credits is also
every single day. Yeah, absolutely.
So is there anything? Is there any kind of takeaway that you get from this that you would like to share?
I think there's a takeaway and a giveaway. I think what Paul mentioned, the farm to fork movement. I think here, I'm in Maryland in the United States. Throughout COVID, I get my food directly from a farmer. He's about 50 miles from me. I get a box each week without hiccup, without a single pesticide, without a single chemical. I've had healthy, lowercase o organic food through COVID, never a hiccup. It's direct, you know, we've kind of figured that out. I think, you know, local is key, but the globalized food system is not going to stop. And I think what Paul described about sourcing fruits and veggies and all kinds of things from around the world, that's also not going to stop. And with that, what we've talked about today is the real key, I think, to solving global problems. And the food companies, the farmers of the world have a lot to learn from smallholder farmers. What I would love to see is that all of the crops that Paul had described, all the regenerative crops, to be grown around the world using the techniques that we see in the tropics. Things grow real fast. We tested them out all the time. I'd love to see temperate, the United States and Europe doing a lot more agroforestry, line plantings. We can continue to reduce fertilizer usage across the board by using some of the techniques that we've been testing out and finding the right families of trees and nitrogen fixing trees. And we can take a regenerative form of growing fruits and make it even better. Livestock, milk, dairy, livestock, there's a lot of ways to use trees to integrate into livestock production and dairy production systems too. And I'd love to see a lot of the agribusinesses around the world begin to take up a lot more of the agroforestry techniques that are going to help them even lower their carbon footprint even more. Carbon is important, but I think making the switch to agroforestry because of the fertilizer usage, because of the impact of a lot of maize-based and soy-based like fodders and stuff like that, animal fodders. We can always do. I think trees and themselves aren't enough. If you look at Italy, look at olives, you know, grown over. It also wears away on the landscape. We do need beneficial trees, nitrogen-fixing trees, other things mixed together in these systems to maintain the long-term, you know, viability. And yes, there's carbon in there. It's a co-benefit. It's a co-product. I don't think it works if you want that to be your main product. It's a good co-benefit along the way. But this is my last point in terms of adding the diversity, adding these trees that are solving other business needs and cutting costs. What we're also able to do is plant these trees in ways that segment farms, and it helps a lot in integrated pest management. So if you're a bug and you want to go from a patch of tomatoes or rosemary to another patch of, if you have to go through some type of row of trees and up some grasses and down below, it's kind of hard to spread. So the integration of trees also has a lot of great benefits on pest management. And we do entire workshops on that too. So not enough time to talk about the pesticides and stuff, but it's all within the practice of everybody that we've been talking about today in the regenerative practice. And
thank you, John. It becomes more and more interesting if we the more we talk. Listen, I think we've got to the time where we will join the Q&A session. But first of all, I wanted to thank you very much to the three of you. You brought a very interesting insights. I think that hopefully we have touched on some of the main aspects about regenerative ag. I keep some notes here about thinking the whole idea more as a system of many components. Carbon is important, but it's not just the only element here. I think we also talk about the importance of farm inputs and farm practices that you were mentioning before. We also talk about diversity, biodiversity as well, and what it means to all these operations. Water is becoming more important, more scarce, more critical, and the market access also as part of delivering these products and capturing the whole value added in these operations. And vertical integration has a role there, working with multiple stakeholders and networks. We also mentioned briefly about the policies and how they can also influence and drive some of the innovations and adoption of different practices. So I guess it's very interesting, very refreshing to hear what you have been doing. I think we can agree that there is so much to do yet. So I want to thank you again. And I want to invite all the audience to join us in the Q&A. We will be glad to share more insights. Thank you so much.